There is a tree growing along the fence lines of 10 million American farms right now. A tree the federal government taught your grandparents to plant during the Dust Bowl because it was the fastest way to restore nitrogen to soil that 3 decades of monoculture had already destroyed. It worked. The stands they planted in the 1930s are still standing today, still fixing nitrogen, still producing wood that outlasts the steel fencing that eventually replaced it. Then the United States Department of Agriculture quietly reclassified it as a weed, not because the science changed, because the economics did. Its fence posts last 100 years in direct soil contact without a single chemical treatment. Its wood is harder than white oak. It fixes more nitrogen per acre than the fertilizer you would pay $300 an acre to apply. Plant it once, and it feeds your family's children and their children, without a seed purchase, without a permit, without a dependency on any supply chain that can fail. The USDA has spent decades calling it invasive. The same agency that ran programs to eradicate it in the 1990s ran programs to plant it in the 1930s. That is not confusion. That is design. Because you cannot build a $40 billion annual commodity empire on a tree that does not need to be replanted. Welcome to the Forgotten Roots Vault. The archive opens in the Appalachian Mountains before the first Europeans set foot on this continent, in a forest where a tree the Cherokee had been using for centuries was quietly doing what no annual crop has ever done. The Cherokee did not use black locust because it was available. Every hardwood in the Appalachians was available. They used it because nothing else performed the way it did. Their finest boughs were black locust, not as a compromise, as a deliberate selection made across generations of observation. The wood bends without fracturing. It stores energy the way no brittle hardwood can. It returns to true. It is elastic in the technical sense. It absorbs force and releases it without memory of the deformation. Cherokee bowyers understood this the way modern materials engineers understand it, except they documented it in practice and passed it through family lines for 1,000 years before any European researcher measured its hardness rating in a laboratory. The Osage used it for the same reason. So did the Delaware. Across the eastern nations, black locust was the premium structural material. Fence posts, load-bearing poles, any application where the wood would face soil, water, or sustained pressure. They planted it along their field edges because they observed something the USDA would not formally document for another 3 centuries. The soil around black locust groves was richer than the soil beyond them. The grass grew taller. The crops performed better. The nitrogen cycle was invisible, but its effects were not. In 1601, a Virginia colonist brought black locust seeds to Jean Robin, royal botanist to King Henry IV of France. Robin planted them in Paris. The tree's genus name is a tribute to him, not because he discovered it, but because European scientists immediately recognized what indigenous knowledge had already proven. Within a century, British and French shipbuilders were specifying black locust for tree nails, the wooden pegs that hold a ship's planking to its frame, because nothing else combined hardness, rot resistance, and elasticity in the same piece of wood. George Washington planted it at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson wrote about it in his farm journals. Colonial fence posts hammered into Virginia soil in the 1700s were documented still standing and structurally sound a century later. No treatment, no replacement, no maintenance. This was not obscure knowledge. This was foundational. In the 1930s, when the Dust Bowl arrived, the USDA Soil Conservation Service ran programs across the eroded southern Appalachians and Great Plains, establishing black locust stands specifically because they knew what it did to degraded land. The science was settled. The results were documented. The trees they planted are still there. Then the 1950s arrived. Then the 1973 Farm Bill. Then the price support mechanisms that made it economically rational for an American farmer to plant soybeans on every available acre because the federal government would backstop the loss if the market did not. The Extension Service dollars followed the commodity dollars. The research priorities followed the extension dollars. Perennial agroforestry programs were quietly defunded. The institutional knowledge of how to establish, manage, and integrate black locust into a working farm system was allowed to dissipate, not through crisis, but through neglect that was indistinguishable from design. There is no extension office program teaching this today, no agricultural college curriculum covering it at scale. The information exists. The infrastructure to deliver it to you was defunded when it stopped generating revenue for the right people. And then the USDA Forest Service classified black locust as invasive in its own native range in states where it has grown since before European contact, while the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, a different arm of the same department, simultaneously recommends it for erosion control and nitrogen fixation. The federal government is currently funding programs to both plant and eradicate the same tree, in some cases in the same state. This is not bureaucratic confusion. A tree that fixes its own nitrogen, produces its own wood, and does not require annual replanting cannot generate the seed sales, the fertilizer contracts, and the equipment financing that built the annual commodity agricultural complex. That complex received $39 billion in federal commodity subsidies between 1995 and 2021. Black locust received a Forest Service eradication budget. This is not an accident. This is the arithmetic of institutional capture. Here is what one black locust planting actually produces. With the numbers, the agricultural industry has no incentive to put in front of you. The wood has a Jonca hardness rating of 1,700 pounds force. White oak, the standard for furniture, flooring, and wine barrels, rates 1,360. Pressure-treated pine, the material currently specified for fence posts across most of America, rates between 380 and 870. Black locust does not need pressure treatment. It sits in Class 1 durability, the highest classification in global timber grading, shared by fewer than a dozen species worldwide. The University of Vermont Extension Service documented black locust fence posts lasting 80 to 100 years in direct soil contact. Pressure-treated pine treated with chromated copper arsenate lasts 15 to 25 years. The first contains no chemicals. The second is soaked in a heavy metal compound. Guess which one American lumberyards stock and which one they stopped teaching farmers to grow. The nitrogen fixation data is just as direct. Black locust fixes 40 to 300 pounds of atmospheric nitrogen per acre per year through its root symbiosis with naturally occurring soil bacteria. Nitrogen fertilizer costs $300 to $500 per acre per application in conventional farming. A black locust stand produces that nitrogen continuously, every year, from the same root system, without purchase, without application, and without watching it wash into the watershed. Hungary understood this decades ago. Black locust now covers 23% of all Hungarian forest land, more than 400,000 hectares, because Hungarian farmers never abandoned the math. Their forests produce 17,000 to 20,000 metric tons of honey per year from a bloom that lasts only 10 to 14 days each year. One tree, 2 weeks of flowers. Enough nectar to supply 40,000 bees through the entire foraging window. Black locust honey accounts for the majority of Hungary's honey exports and sells at a premium across European markets. When the trees are cut, the root system does not die. It resprouts. This is called coppice. Agroforestry research documents black locust coppice systems producing 4 to 8 tons of dry biomass per acre per year on indefinite rotations. The same root system, the same planting investment, producing harvestable wood every 7 to 10 years for 100 years. So here's the question that should make you furious. During the Dust Bowl, the federal government knew what fixed soil. They planted it. The trees they established in the 1930s are still growing. Then, when commodity economics made it profitable to return to annual crops, the programs that funded perennial restoration were quietly discontinued. The trees were reclassified as threats, And that decision has a cost that is still accumulating. The Dust Bowl was not a weather event. It was the bill arriving for 3 decades of monoculture farming that destroyed the biological structure of Great Plains topsoil. Root systems that had built 3 feet of living soil over 10,000 years were replaced with annual crops that left bare ground exposed to wind for 6 months every year. 3.5 million people left. The federal government, facing the consequences of its own agricultural policy, turned to what the data said would fix soil fastest. It worked. Then they stopped teaching it. American topsoil is currently losing 3 to 6 tons per acre per year under conventional commodity farming, according to the United States Department of Agriculture's own erosion estimates. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone, oxygen-depleted water covering 6,000 to 8,000 square miles, is fed primarily by synthetic nitrogen fertilizer runoff from Midwest commodity fields. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations estimates that 1.7 billion acres of global farmland are currently degraded. We are paying, in soil loss and ecosystem collapse, for the arithmetic that made it rational to replace a perennial nitrogen-fixing tree with an annual crop that requires nitrogen to be purchased, applied, and watched as it washes downstream. The people who kept planting black locust anyway were not radicals. They were farmers who looked at a fence post that had been standing since their grandfather drove it in and decided the math was obvious. Black locust never disappeared. The eradication programs did not reach every fence line, every hillside, every abandoned farm where someone hammered a post into clay soil in 1937 and walked away. The tree coppiced when they cut it. It spread when they ignored it. It is growing right now along the edges of the fields that replaced it. Here is how to bring it back to work. Bare root seedlings cost $2 to $5 each, and they are available through most state nurseries and agroforestry suppliers. Plant in early spring, 8 to 10 feet apart for timber production, or 4 to 6 feet for coppice biomass. In the first year, they establish roots. In the second year, they grow 3 to 8 feet. By the third year, nitrogen fixation is measurable in adjacent soil. By the 5th year, the flowers bloom, creamy white, heavily fragrant, and fully edible. Use them fresh in fritters, steep them in simple syrup, or leave them for the bees and harvest the honey in summer. By the 10th year, you have fence posts that will outlast you. By the 20th year, you have structural timber. Cut them to the stump. They come back from the root. The flowers are the safe, edible harvest. Seeds and bark contain compounds that require heat processing to neutralize. Do not consume them raw. Check your state's invasive species classification before purchasing seedlings. The designation is contested and varies by county, and some states have removed it entirely. 1 planting weekend, 1 century of harvest. You cannot build a quarterly revenue model on this tree. That is the only reason it is not in every agricultural extension bulletin in America. Every person who plants one is restoring something that was officially erased. Not because it stopped working, but because it refused to generate profit for the institutions that decided what American farmers were allowed to grow. They called it invasive. It was native. They funded its eradication. The fence posts from the 1930s are still standing. Subscribe to Forgotten Roots. Share this with someone who has a fence line to plant and meet us at the next vault. The archive does not close. The knowledge was never gone. It was growing at the edge of the field the whole time, waiting for someone to ask why those old posts are the only ones that never rotted.